Great. Well, so food security. We started the discussion off today talking about the global economy, and the question of food security was touched upon quite a few times throughout that discussion. We went on to talk about climate, and again, this is a topic that is very interlinked to climate. And certainly it's a topic that we see continuously at the top of minds of institutions and governments in this region, which is one that has particular challenges for food security. So I just wanted, before we really dive into this panel, just or dive into the different subtopics, would like to kind of go through the panel and talk about the different segments of food security as kind of an investment strategy or an investment class, and highlighting each of your individual participation in that value chain. So maybe, Jamie, if you could start off with how investors look at food security and the role that your organization plays.
Sure. So thank you very much for the invitation and the question. So I run a vertical farming technology and data company. So my perspective is very much focused on controlled environment agriculture, which vertical farming is one subset of it. Can nobody hear me? There we go, that's much better. So yes, I represent the vertical farming sector. My company participates in that. We've been around for about 7 years. So vertical farming is one particular part of controlled environment agriculture, which investors look upon with a bit of skepticism at present, because really we've had a lot of disruption in the market over the last couple of years. It's a very embryonic, burgeoning market, which has had a lot of capital inflow going into it over the last 10 years, but has not necessarily succeeded in its goals. And I think one of the reasons for that is there've been misaligned expectations with the types of investors that have actually got involved in vertical farming. PE and venture capital funds that have 2 to 3 year time horizons in terms of recouping their capital. The way that we look at it is that vertical farming and food security should be a long-term infrastructure investment. When we look at our projects, and we build the technology and then sometimes operate the farms and provide the data to the farms across the world. These are really long-term investments, and we look at them at a 20, 30, 40, 50 year time horizon. So the type of capital that's appropriate for that is obviously infrastructure investment. We work with a lot of infrastructure funds that are happy to invest on a long-term basis and pick up an 8% yield. And really I think that's really been the misalignment to date in terms of food security for us. And I also think, just from a thematic standpoint, people talk a lot about food, but they forget about things like water. Water is a huge crisis that I think is going to become more prominent in future years. And obviously, vertical farming is 95 to 98% more productive, and we use far less water than traditional farming methods. There's also the health angle relating to pesticides. But I think just one summary comment is that my view is that we're slowly sleepwalking into a major global food and water crisis, and we really need investors that are willing to perhaps exchange some of their expectations on returns for the attainment of goals with respect to food security.
So touching upon a lot of points there. So Lisandro, if you wouldn't mind expanding on some of the points that Jamie touched upon, because I know several of those are near and dear to your heart, and then briefly sharing which part of the kind of value chain you're involved in food security.
Yes, thank you very much. Honored to be here. And please tell me, Lisandro, stop, because I can talk 1 hour for that. So food security is related to providing and feeding people around the world, because because food is and nurturing people is a necessary condition for peace. And this theme has been very much understood here in this part of the world, especially after the disruption of the Ukraine war that has somehow created a problem to assuring the resiliency needed for feeding not only, I would say, of course, the Emirates that are only 10 million people, but the Saudis, but the MENA region in general, and you are talking about 1.6 billion people. And if you want to duplicate the production of food, as FAO, United Nations Organization predicts it's necessary to assure peace in the world, there are things that have to be done in terms of increasing the productivity. That's the reason why my fund is investing in technologies that foster with deep techs, that means artificial intelligence, that assure that the value chain of the food production is digitalized. And digitalization of agriculture is a major challenge, especially for the farmers. And for that reason, I learned a year ago that traveling with 100 farmers, what were they looking for? Technologies of traceability of coffee, traceability of potatoes, traceability of corn, traceability of soybean. The reason is that people want to know what they drink, what they eat, and this has to be not only knowing what they eat or what they drink, but also to know that this is being done under climate sustainable way, and even, not only the climate, I agree completely with you, also that the water is being used efficiently. So this challenge, climate and agriculture production, became the same theme, and technologies for this are now available to assure the monitoring of all this process. So the reason why this business model did not succeed so far is because the objectives of the technology people were to sell to the farmers, and you do not scale up when you sell farmer by farmer. Really, the traction of the digitalization of the value chain in agriculture and food is driven by leading brands of food, beverages, and retailers of the world. Is the people that, and this is not something that is going to occur in many years. I can assure you that you are not going to buy a Starbucks coffee that doesn't show the QR. You are not going to buy a chicken, you are not going to buy meat that doesn't show the traceability of where the meat is coming from. If you are not going to have a bread that is not showing where the meat is coming from and it has been produced in a sustainable way. I thought that this is the long-term vision. But yesterday night, I went to the coffee here, in the Jumeirah Towers Emirates Hotel. And for my surprise, if you want to have a coffee at the breakfast meeting here, it shows this coffee and the packaging is certified traceable. And they show the metric and the standards for that. So for some reason, investors have not yet taken the conclusion of where the opportunity is. And when you want to produce and eat chicken and meat, you will have to put together two regions that so far have been completely separated, which is South America and the GCC countries. Of course, you can nurture yourself of fresh fruits and vegetables, where digital farming and hydroponics, and maybe of fish. But if you want to eat bread, you want to eat chicken, you want to eat meat, you need traceable corn, you need traceable wheat, you need traceable soybean. So my fund is focused in investing in monitoring with deepest tech technologies, all this value chain.
So talking about the organization that you're at, Yoram, because it actually has taken an interesting approach to solving some of the challenges that we highlighted. You're in a different part of the value chain with I'll let you share about where you are in the value chain, but addressing the fact that we have kind of two components. So we talked about an infrastructure component, we talked about a technology component, we talked about how do you scale technology, how do you do that within capital structures that work. So we'd love to hear a little bit about what your organization is doing and how you've tackled some of the challenges that were highlighted in our discussion thus far.
Sure. So, look, I mean, we are essentially, I'm a partner in a private equity boutique structure that is very unique in the sense that we only have one company in our portfolio, and that company is a company we created from scratch called Pure Salmon. So we're actually entrepreneurs. Instead of doing a seed, Series A, Series B, what we did is we launched a private equity firm to have funds to raise the capital we needed to develop the business. Why did we do that? Because when it comes to applying investment and technology to agriculture, there are a number of things that make the entire enterprise very complicated. One is, if you want to seize any large opportunity in agriculture, you're already talking about $1 billion. There's no, I mean, if you really want to tackle some of the big opportunities out there, you're talking about a huge amount of capital that are needed. So you can either, try and gather 1,000 farmers in India at the micro level, but you're really barely scraping the surface of that single region in India, or farmers in Brazil, or you can try and think about the need for protein generally around the world and how much we're going to need. But if you start looking at the capital you're going to need to mobilize to do these kind of things, you're talking huge amounts. The issue you have is that agriculture is traditionally a space where investment cycles are really long. So you don't really have short-term returns. It's a space where, for a lot of this subsector, a lot of the big, large financial investors have not looked at the space. So if you take aquaculture, for example, aquaculture is the fastest growing food sector on the planet. It's not me saying it, it's the UNFAO, right? And it has been for the past 20 years. It's a sector that essentially belongs to a few Norwegian families and Chilean families. There are very few large financial institutions invested in the space. And so one of the things that we were trying to bridge with a structure like this was to basically bring these investors, these sovereign funds, these large pension funds, into the space, because we're going to need the kind of capital they can mobilize. And this is why. So today we're backed by 4 sovereign funds, some in the regions here, some in Asia. But that was one of the points. And then the last piece is agriculture. If you think about it, was the last sector to actually really be disrupted by technology. We've applied disruption over the years in many, many sectors: automotive, renewables, energies, in the finance, insurance. And it really came really late to agriculture. And so the application of IoT, big data, AI, all these new technologies is actually quite recent. And again, in order to be able to roll them out into the space, the amount of capital that is needed is huge, but not at the proof of concept level. And this is where you get the infrastructure link. It is that the scale is the difficult part, right? Anyone can get a proof of concept off the ground. Anyone can get small catalytic capital to have a small agricultural, small vertical farm, small proof of concept. But when you talk about really reaching infrastructure size, really getting this large offtake agreements in place that are tackling food security for an entire region or an entire country, the scale and the capital that it requires means that you need to engage a lot more investors that were traditionally not engaged in the space.
So that drives really home one of the points around what you were discussing earlier, Jamie, around how investors need to look at opportunities differently in terms of term structure, financing, understanding that you need these pilots can look great, but in order to achieve the scale, the unit economics that are necessary for them to be financially not only feasible but financially attractive, particularly in a world where capital is becoming very expensive and investment returns are available quite widely in the market. So how have you been able to tackle these challenges, and how has the role of the public sector versus the private sector been supportive, and what are some of the challenges public versus private financing.
Yes.
If you start with Jamie, and then I'll jump over to you if you don't mind.
So yeah, apologies. I did jump ahead a bit in my first response on some of these points, but yeah, for me, I think this needs to be predominantly private sector led. But as I said, there is a misalignment in terms of return expectations. I think it's very easy to set up a small shipping container farm in the middle of a city and sell produce at 10 times market value and say that you're addressing food security, but food security is about reducing inequalities, providing produce at price parity, and so on. And so there's been a lot of activity there, but really the question is, how serious are we, and how forward-looking should we be in terms of our exit time horizons in addressing food security? And yeah, I think, the private sector need to lead on this and have been leading on this. It really very much depends on which geography we're talking about. There have been some very excellent initiatives and government announcements in for example, the UAE, the 30 by 30 initiative, and for example, Singapore, where we have a farm, again, 30 by 30 initiative. But yeah, I mean, places like the UK, governments are really not doing much. There's a lot of talk. There's a lot of buzzwords like ESG, like AI, like machine learning, like looking after farmers and making sure that we can feed our populations with healthy produce. But in reality, there hasn't really been much action, or it takes too long. And these are really long-term projects that need to be given adequate thought and consideration. And governments, for me, are not moving quickly enough. So I return to my point that, yeah, the private sector does need to lead on this.
So, Lisandro, you were chomping at the bit to join this part of the discussion. So we'd love to hear.
Yeah, well, as my colleague said, the challenge in food security is how to scale up farmers and how farmers will adopt. The problem is that I can assure you, you are not going to scale up if you go farmer by farmer. You are going to scale up if your technology is implemented by Walmart, is implemented by Whole Foods, is implemented by Tesco, is implemented by Amaral, is implemented by the very big players that will say, I want your product, farmer, to be somehow produced this way, traced this way, because I have to have metrics to show that I am monitoring that this is produced in a sustainable way, without chemicals, and with soil regeneration in a circular approach, and it's going to take time. But the clients for this are not the farmers, in principle, are the very big distributors of food and beverages around the world that will implement these technologies with the farmers. And the important thing is that the client for my technologies are the CFO of these corporations, the chief financial. Why? Because capital markets pay for that. The new thing is that the value of your shares is going to be higher into your exit if you show that you have metrics, and you can show the metrics, and only technology can show the metrics, with satellite information, artificial intelligence that shows that you are doing this, and that. And capital markets already pay a premium for companies that show that they are complying with a calendar of sustainability. And from a perspective of public policy, two major issues in the agenda. First, to finally, at the COP28, decide what's going to be the price of CO2, because it is not measured in the calculation of these economies of scale, as economists want to, these externalities, economists say. We are not paying the price of pollution. So until the governments do not agree on how to measure the price of pollution, the dynamics will be slower. We have an opportunity now where here in the Emirates, because you people, I am watching to you people, you have the opportunity of establishing this in the agenda because you have now the coordination of the COP28. And so yes, private sector through capital markets and tax incentives will do the job.
Yoram, do you think governments are doing enough? Are they creating the right incentives? I mean, you've been provided, your firm's been provided capital at one end, but on the consumption end, or looking further down the value chain, do you think governments could be doing more?
There is a complete disconnection about the Vision 2030 of governments in the GCC countries, and you talk about UAE, you talk about Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, and what is being executed. When you read what should be done, they talk about health and food security. When you see what's being invested, it's not there. So this mismatch is something that will have to be somehow bridged. And I can tell you, I was the first venture capital in Latin America technology. So I'm doing things that nobody does. So I am driven by the opportunity, not by what's going on behind. So I can tell you now, the opportunity is to match governments' projects, visions, even strategies and some financing, I would say, with what is being done by us in executing. And I would say some family offices would be very nice if they accompany us. I think that we are in the middle of this process. We are in the middle of this process, and we are not yet there, but when it's going to happen a chain reaction where we have to have projects ours that show that we are scaling up and having good success stories that we don't have in agriculture food yet at a significant amount. People will follow.
Yoram, I'd love to hear your views on these points. Do you think governments are doing enough?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's difficult for government to put the right incentive in place. I think they're certainly thinking strongly about it. I think you've seen food security orientated plans or visions all around the world. To give you an example, we have projects in Japan, in the US, in France, in Brunei. We have a project here in the Middle East. Every single locations we've been to, we've received some kind of support through land, tax incentive, grant, subsidize. So you can't deny this is in place. That being said, you have a number of issues that are really difficult to control. So one example is Singapore. They have this plan called 30 by 30, where they've tried strongly to incentivize their kind of own food security, local food independence, only to realize after a few years that Singapore is really small and is very expensive, and basically they're not going to be able to build anything locally, so they're going to have to rely on others. I think another thing that is important is that governments are taking into account the fact that it's not just about food scarcity, but it's also about nutritional scarcity, and you're starting to see that in plants. So let me explain what I mean. We don't have so much, I'm going to be a bit controversial here, but it's factual. We don't have so much a problem of food hunger anymore. We have a problem of obesity more than we have a problem of hunger. So we certainly have the hunger issue in developing countries and some of the poorest countries. But in the developed world, obesity for many years now has vastly outnumbered the underfed. And so when we know that the diet is one of the leading predictor of all-cause mortality, there is a very strong incentive that's being put by the government to have not only enough food, but the right quality and the right type of food. So think about, our neighbor here in Saudi, for example, have been very, very strong in terms of limiting the amount of meat that their population consumes, not because, it's difficult to source meat, just because that proportion is too high and the amount of cardiovascular disease is too high, and so on. So you have all these issues that all governments, I think, have a role to take part to in terms of planning all this. But then you have, the global, the kind of the globalization trends where it's still, if you're in France and you want to buy French strawberries, they're still going to be more expensive than Spanish strawberries or Australian strawberries sometimes that have come from across the world. And so you have to be able to balance that in a way that makes sense economically for the local farmers. And that's really difficult to do.
I'm scanning the audience for any questions, so feel free to put your hand up. Otherwise, I'm going to keep firing away. So we've talked about quite a bit about what governments and incentives, and we highlighted the importance that at the end of the day that to achieve scale that you need the support of the big the big consumer led distribution platforms. So where are the consumer incentives? Where in the United States, I mean, where would Tesla be today if there was not an incentive to buy a Tesla on the consumer? Why have we not seen any consumer-driven incentives to drive to nudge consumers towards the right product mix? And would that not enable some of the other incentive structures to better align? Jamie, I'd love to hear if you have any views on that.
It's an interesting question. It depends on depends on geography. I think using the US example and considering the fact that it's no secret that vertical farms have limitations on the types of produce that they can produce, and produce versus meat versus other products in supermarkets are valued very differently from consumers. And I think what we're finding in the UK is that people really, especially we're going through a recession, there's a huge cost of living crisis. Customers really value, above all at the minute, price and availability over some of the other kind of what I think are more important, depending on context, goals, ESG-focused goals and so on. In the US, people are more prepared to pay more of a premium and so on. But I think consumer-driven incentives long-term, once we figure all this out, should be health, sustainability, climate change, and so on, and really that kind of collective effort to address what is a really major issue. But in the short term, I think people focus on how much money is in their pocket.
Yes. Well, I would differentiate very much 20% of the population of the world that want to know what they eat, of 80% of the population of the world that they want to know if they are going to eat tomorrow. So for the 20% that wants to know what they eat, incentives are very easy. They are my children. My children are demanding me, Dad, I want to have healthy nutrition. I want to have something that comes with sustainability. I want to know, but it's the education they already have in the developed world. So zero incentive needed. You are going to go to any supermarket, go to Whole Foods in the US, and everything is traced, everything is sustainable. If not, you are not going to, and Whole Foods somehow anticipates what's the trend in the longer term. It's like having the newspaper of the next 5 years. So it's already there. For the 80% of the people that want to know what if they're going to eat tomorrow, which is something that is not so strong in this panel, I feel. But think honestly, if there is hunger in Egypt because there is not enough wheat because of the supply chain of Ukraine, you are going to have problems politically all around the region. I can anticipate this. I can anticipate. So food security for the 80% of the world is a question of sustainable, political, and predictable environment. It's not something nice to have. Of course, it's a good to have, but it's also institutionally needed to avoid what today is one of the biggest problems of the world, which is migrations because of conflicts and migrations because of hunger, because of the conflicts. And so I would say that take the Gaza Strip today. Urgent need of addressing the food security there if we want to have any type of peace, not scaling up. Not scaling up. So food security is not only a question of nutrition, it's a question of political stability. I'm not talking of a small region, because if we don't control the food security of Gaza, we are going to have big problems, not only at the regional, but they can scale up. So I would say that incentives are already there. The question is, what's the role of us as the investors, of sovereign wealth funds, as limited partners, family offices, to bridge this gap so that we can live in peace?
Yoram, just a final question, and let's follow Lisandro's guidance and talk about the other 80% of the market. So for that other 80%, their diet is not composed of there's a protein deficit. How do you see food security investments, technology, particularly given that that's the segment of the market that you're addressing? Do you think we're going to be able to address protein access for that other 80%?
Yeah,
there's a huge gap, both on seafood and on meat. So it's the issue is that it's really difficult to scale meat sustainably. It's almost physically impossible, simply because the use of resources is extremely inefficient. You need 8 kilos of feed to get 1 kilo of beef, right? So chicken, pork, a little bit more efficient, but you're still very far off what you can do with seafood. Now, so I would say until we apply the kind of lab-grown, alternative plant-based kind of technology to the meat space, it's going to be very difficult to tackle that gap. You have to be very careful, though, because I really would hate, and I'm afraid this is what we're going through, to see what the solar industry went through 20 years ago, where we burned trillions of capital on projects that are unit economics that didn't work out. And this is what has happened recently with the plant-based kind of alternative protein. So that's the challenge for meat. And for seafood, it's just about farming. It's really, it's something we haven't done much in the space, and for that you just need to grow aquaculture. You don't want to be fishing out more of the sea. You can't. It's 90% overfished, as we all know, and so it's really about developing the infrastructure to apply farming to the seafood sector.
Could take some questions from the audience.
I think Jamie was going to add one point to that, and then, yeah, of course, I would love any questions from the audience.
Just very briefly, I think clearly the vertical farming sector is quite a long way off of producing grains at price parity, which is where we should be. I'd say that what we need to happen to get there are further genetic breakthroughs. So we do work with, for example, gene editing companies, which is distinctly different as well from GMO. There needs to be significant capital investment, because you're talking about massive scale farms to be able to address the issues around grains and more staple crops, not lettuces and microgreens and tomatoes and so on. But I do think we are on a good trajectory, but it really does need a very concerted effort. So,
do you have any questions from the audience? Could I get a microphone, please? And if you can address the question, if you have a specific panelist, then let us know.
Hello. Hi, my name is Cefaratti. I'm the founder of Trident Capital. My question is to the last comment that was made by Jamie, which is the security of the staple grains. In a world where one war knocks off the wheat supply chain, where floods and famines and climate change induced excesses are getting more frequent and more extreme, and a world where we are decoupling in some ways, it seems that there's a coordinated effort that is required from across the governments. Just if you can, maybe end on that note as to how you see that shaping up over the next 5 years.
Right. I think we're already seeing that in places like Ukraine, you know, the breadbasket of Europe and in Vietnam and, you know, where we get most of our rice. So I think in terms of, you know, we're involved in very large scale projects. You know, we're talking about huge, you know, 100,000 square meter plus vertical farm bids in this region and in other parts of the world where we are focused on grains. We're aware that the unit economics are not quite there yet. So in such a scenario, you would be faced with probably a model that would have to be deployed very quickly, but pricing would clearly be higher. Therefore, you would have to have the government step in to subsidize so that it's available for the populace. And I also think there's a very interesting carbon credit angle here, which I didn't want to go into on this panel, but there's an angle there that we need to explore more in the context of our sector in particular. But I put a very negative spin on it just to try and be realistic, because there have been a lot of claims in vertical farming about what can be grown at price parity. But I'm an eternal optimist and actually do think that if we do get in such a situation, which I think we will in as little as 5 or 10 years, that we can come up with a concerted solution.
Any other questions? Go ahead. Do we have a microphone? Thank you.
Sandeep Khanna, I'm based out of Johannesburg. I've been investing on the continent for the last 25 years and I've built few food businesses in my life. Just like your view on, you talk about technology and the way things are going, but unlocking the supply chain and disintermediating to ensure that there's inclusiveness of the farmers from farm to fork. Given the wastage of food we have, right? How does that fit in the comments, some of the observations you have made? Because we're putting a lot more on the technology, but not going back to the basics and the fundamentals and the challenges that have been outlined in the last 25-30 minutes. So I would like to get your views on that.
Yes, may I? Yes. I completely agree. It's estimated that 40% of fresh fruits and vegetables do not reach the consumer because they are wasted. And in my portfolio, I have companies that are addressing exactly this issue to monitor the freshness of the food, to calendarize what's been done so that the farmers will receive proper compensation, because the supermarket is implementing technologies that organizes all the supply chains. That's the way I think it's going to be done. It's going to be done with the articulation of the very big distributors willing to implement technologies that reduce waste. And who pays for that? The value of the share of the supermarket. Because if they can show that they have metrics that reduce 20%, as is the value proposition of my portfolio company, the waste, the valuation of the share is higher. And this valuation of the share is higher will compensate for even better pricing for the farmer that adopts the technology. That's the way I see the process going. And it's being executed today. Is not deployed at our eyes completely, but I can assure you that all these people, I mean the very big firms, are willing, from the perspective of the valuation of their capital markets valuation, to implement these metrics in benefit of the farmers. Moreover, if you do intensive irrigation, for example, you go to technologies of companies that are doing that, and they say that if you can show the metrics that you are doing your water consumption this way and your carbon credit this way, because they monitor through irrigation, now all the information is in the cloud, they reduce 30% the cost of implementing irrigation. And this is translated into the farmers as a benefit for their production function.
Fascinating insights. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you for the great questions. Give a round of applause, please, for our food security panel.